So yeah, I'm Emily from the Emerging Minds Network. I'm really happy to welcome you to this webinar. So we are hosting a Zoom webinar, but also as we've seen there, we are also going live on YouTube as well. So welcome to everybody. And we're really pleased to be working with Andre at the Mental Health to share today's session in that way. So yeah, so over the next hour, we're going to be hearing from two leading experts in the field of looking at screen time and young people's mental health. And we're going to answer questions from you, our audience here. We've had a lot of questions come in so far from practitioners and parents, and we really hope to address as many of those as possible. So we've got an audience of about 100 people in the webinar. And they're going to be able to comment and ask questions as we go along, and we've received a lot of questions already, so thank you very much to people who've shared those. And also we've got this wider audience on YouTube, so very much a warm welcome to you as well. And please do give us a virtual wave and keep the conversation going in the comments on YouTube, but also on Twitter as well. And we will be making this webinar available. It'll be available on YouTube and also the Emerging Minds website as well. So you can look at it there. I'm just going to share my screen with you now so you can see my presentation. What I'm going to do is actually hand straight over to Pete, who's going to be our first speaker today. So Pete is a reader in psychology and science communication at Bar University. And Pete's current research interests lie in understanding the short and long-term behavioural effects of playing video games. And Pete's going to give a short presentation, which will be followed by an opportunity to ask questions. And his talk is going to focus on games, different types of screen time, what they are, and how to consider what might be appropriate at different ages. So please don't forget to post your comments in the chat box and the questions here, or use the Emerging Minds hashtag on social media. Thanks, Pete.
Thanks very much, Emily. Nice to see everybody here today. So as Emily said, I'm Pete. I'm a reader in psychology and science communication at Bath Spa, and I do work primarily on video games, but increasingly on screen time as well. What I wanted to do today, I think there's a bit of a caveat to this talk to begin with, which is that there's so much stuff, and I think that was evident in some of the questions that we got as well, and the variety of questions. There's so much stuff that we want to and need to cover. We're probably not going to be able to get through everything that we want to say today, but we'll try our best. But what I wanted to try and do with this talk really is just provide a bit of a general overview of some of the recent reviews and research on screen time that maybe kind of give us a footing on which to think about how to navigate what feels like what is a very difficult situation in the home, about how we kind of balance screen time with other sorts of activities. And I guess the first thing to say about all of this is that screen time is basically a meaningless concept in that specific terminology. And the reason I say that is because it just refers to everything, right? So it refers to using social media, it refers to playing video games, using Wikipedia, watching videos, coming to webinars. Literally everything that we do on a screen counts as screen time. And I think that's an important caveat to any sort of research that you look at on screen time effects, because we as researchers tend to focus on screen time as a sort of broad general measure. It's quite a compelling measure to use for researchers because it's an easy number to grab, how much of your time during the day you spent in front of a screen in some way. But what that does is miss pretty much everything that we do on screens. So we can break screen time down into these sorts of categories that you can see here. I've got just 6 here, but we can actually break that down even more. So social media, in a sense, is a meaningless category because there are so many different types. Twitter primarily text-based, things like Snapchat primarily video-based, Instagram primarily photo-based, and there's a mix of all of these sorts of things as well. Even if you take one of those groupings and dive deeper into it. So if you look at video games, for instance, you can break video games down into the types of video games they are, the genres, how people play them, what sorts of views they see when they play those sorts of video games. So if we just take that particular list there, it's just a random list primarily of games that I've been playing quite a lot recently. But there's no kind of single easy way of categorizing these sorts of things. So some games you can play as both single and multiplayer games. Some are first person perspective, third person perspective. Some are competitive, some are cooperative, some are both. Some are quote unquote violent or action or fast paced games. Others are more kind of relaxing and mindful games. And because there's this heady mix of all of these things, it makes it very difficult from a research perspective to disentangle what potential specific effects there might be of playing specific games. And that's why we kind of tend to default back to these more coarse categories of maybe genres or video games generally. And you can kind of wind that back all up to talking about screen time as this broad categorization. So I think that's the first thing to say. I'll talk a little bit about some of the research from the past year or so in a minute, but as with any work in this area, there are a number of caveats that I think are worth bearing in mind before all of this. First is technology changes quite quickly. Science moves quite slowly, so we're always playing catch up with the research. We've never really got a situation where we're looking at what's happening right now and in the moment. And I think that's particularly important and a bit of a pain for the situation that we're in now. Second thing to say is that experimental studies, so things that you do in the lab where you precisely manipulate and change one variable to see how that affects something else in terms of behavior, those are really useful to interpret and develop causal directional effects for screen technology, but they're really hard to do well. You need lots of people, you need lots of money and lots of tech to do it. And there aren't that many studies out there that do that. As an example of how difficult it is to do this, there's a really interesting study that came out by David Ellis last year that looked at what we primarily use is self-report measures of things like screen time and smartphone use. So you get people to report how much of the day do you use your phone or how much of the day you on social media and things like that. Turns out that there's lots of different measures of those, lots of different questionnaires that you can use. None of them correlate particularly well with actual objective use. So a lot of the research that we've got out there at the minute where people try and quantify smartphone or screen time use in those sorts of ways, we can't be sure what it is that they're actually measuring. And actually, I saw literally just this morning a study that came out. It's been a preprint that's not been peer reviewed yet, but suggests that these sorts of smartphone use scales don't correlate particularly well with actual smartphone use, but they do correlate well with things like mental well-being, so negative issues in well-being. So there's a question around what it is that they're actually measuring. The other thing to say is that a lot of research in this area is longitudinal in nature or cross-sectional in nature, and they're good because they provide us quite a broad overview of what's going on in thousands or tens of thousands of people. But because of the nature of those sorts of studies, it can often be hard to infer causality. So you can, if you're particularly looking at people's behaviors and activities at a single time point, so lots of smartphone use, lots of negative mental health effects, it's difficult to infer causality from those sorts of findings. Also from a kind of public engagement, science communication perspective, these are often very complex studies that are quite difficult to interpret the findings of. It's not usually the case that you'll see a simple, as one thing goes up, another thing goes down sorts of results. And like I say, the caveat additionally is that all of this research has been done in a time before coronavirus. So current events, the extent to which we can translate those findings, we're not quite clear on yet. Hopefully some positive messages though. So a study that came out recently by Downey and Gibbs suggests that actually if we're worried about things like face-to-face social skills in kids, maybe we don't need to be as much as we are. We call this the kids these days effect, and I'm sure we're all responsible for this in some way, shape or form, that, we think about what our childhoods were like, and we go, our kids these days, they don't know they're born, and they don't do the things like we used to do. Just kind of look through rose-tinted glasses of what our childhoods were like. But actually, things aren't getting worse by a lot of accounts. So this study looked at the early childhood longitudinal study, which is a study in the US that kind of goes on year, and basically compared evaluations from parents and teachers of kids' social skills from 2 time points, so 1998 and 2010. 2010 is not now, obviously, so we've got 10 years of social media and tech changes to account for there, but that's the latest year for which the data is currently available. But what they found, nevertheless, was that there doesn't seem to be any differences in face-to-face social skills. So it's not the case that kids in 2010 were rated as being more poor at social interactions than their 1998 counterparts when accounting for things like increases in screen time use. There was basically no evidence for any effects of screen use on well-being. Actually, generally, although they were non-significant findings, so basically there are no differences, there were very slight improvements, so certainly not in the direction that you would expect if you think that screen tech is a negative thing. There were some negative associations in that study, so for very, very heavy social media use or very heavy video game use, there were some negative impacts on social skills, but these were tiny. And this is the general finding that we've got from the best research evidence out there at the minute, that if you look broadly across all sorts of different types of screen time, either the results are inconsistent, so you find some negative or some positive effects. The best stuff says that there's not really much in terms of effects at all. Where those associations do show negative slants, they always tend to be small and really not worth worrying about. I think Amy's going to go into this in more detail, but she published research last year with Andy Shabilsky at Oxford that was based on, I think I'm right in saying this, that it was 3.2 billion analyses. It's a wonderful, crazy paper, and I've got the link to it at the end of these slides. Or basically, what they were trying to do is show what the effects of digital tech use are, and the take-home message there was that if you're looking at it in the context of well-being, there's very little effect of digital tech use, but also the fact that you can do so many different sorts of analyses using different types of measures and different aspects of measures shows that we really need to be careful about how we ask these sorts of questions. Other research has just shown that basically if you take what's called ecological momentary assessment, which is where you get adolescents to kind of self-report a few times a day on what they're doing and how they're feeling. If you do that over a 14-day period, there's no suggestion that on days where kids use screen time for more of the day, that seems to coincide with days where they're feeling more depressed.
So Pete, just a few minutes, just quick reminder.
Yeah, that's fine. So that's the sort of good. We don't need to worry about these things too much. I think there are some areas where we do need to be careful. So there's some evidence to suggest that where we do see risk of online harm in things like bullying and victimization and some forms of mental health issues, they tend to mirror what's happening offline anyway. At the same time, so kids who are bullied offline tend to be more likely to be bullied online as well. Again, though, we're not sure what the causal direction is there, and it depends on the type of screen use and how they're engaging with it, where we'll see those sorts of effects that affect directions. We'll come back to this. I'm going to skip this because I'm just conscious of time, but technology is a good thing, though. Technology is a tool, right? So we've got to use it responsibly. So there are ways in which we can leverage it to try and maximize the positives to make treatments or interventions more available, particularly at this time when people can't get out of their houses anyway. I do research on video games. The general take-home message with video games is that there's not that much to worry about, really. Violent video games don't drive kids to become more aggressive or towards murder in the most extreme cases. Those sorts of claims are overblown. The best research suggests that the effects, if there are any, are minimal. When worry about things like addiction, similar sort of things. So the WHO included gaming disorder as a clinically diagnosable condition last year in ICD-11. It's not a particularly good measure. So we don't have any consensus on what the prevalence rate is at the minute. The diagnostic criteria are pretty much all over the place. For the vast majority of users, video games aren't going to be addictive. So that's not something that I think we should be worrying parents about now. The last thing that I just want to say very briefly is that obviously things like the rules around screen time and the research about it don't necessarily apply in the current situation. What can we do here though? Well, I think these three things, flexibility, curiosity, and conversations, are really the key thing. So we know generally that hard and fast limits don't work in typical situations, so they're even less likely to work when everybody's stuck in the home. Now, we know that conversations, collaborative, positive, supportive conversations with kids about their tech use are the best way to go. So if you try and kind of impose an authoritarian approach where you say, you know, no more than an hour of video games now, there's some lines of research that suggest that if you do that, kids are more likely to rebel and do it anyway, but they're also more likely to hide their tech use. And that's a situation that we really don't want to get into, because what we need to be doing in these sorts of situations is understanding what and how and why and when and who with they're using screens. If you provide a more supportive environment saying, well, I would like you to not do this because of these reasons, why would you like to do it? And try and instill guidelines that way. Kids will still rebel because they're kids, but they're much less likely to hide their tech use. So all of this is couched within an idea of, and I know it's a really hard thing to do, trying to understand more what it is that kids are using, what video games are out there, what different types of social media are out there, so that we can generate those positive conversations with them about what we would like them to use and what the best types of use are. I'm just going to stick that slide up for a second. These slides will be available later on anyway, but there's lots and lots of resources out there with parental advice guides on what different apps and games do what and what are most appropriate for different ages. And the best guidelines that we've got for screen time out there are from the RCPCH, which are available at the top.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Pete. Thank you very much for that. So we've got a few minutes for some questions for Pete. Now, we've had one question which I think is really relevant. So, so Claire picked up on, I think you talked about one particular study where the term very heavy use was used. And I guess that's just raises a question that came up a lot from participants, which is really like, how much is too much?
I'm just trying to think off the top of my head what it was in that particular study. I think it was
Downey and Gibbs study?
6 to 7 hours or so.
Right.
So we're talking about a lot of time. When I talk about this sort of stuff, the kind of common phrase that always comes up, which always seems like a little bit of a cop-out, is everything in moderation, right? But it is kind of a sensible approach to think about here. And Andy Shabilsky's work at Oxford has looked at this, in that some screen time is better than none at all. For very extreme amounts of screen time, where we're talking about sort of 7, 8, 9+ hours more, you do see drops in mental well-being, but they're not massive drops still. So that's a good thing. But I think the thing to bear in mind is if we're getting to a situation where somebody is doing the same thing, be it social media or video games or, I don't know, playing football or reading books or eating or whatever, for the vast majority of the waking day, you've got to look at the underlying causes of that. And it's not necessarily the thing that they're doing that's driving that. It might be other factors that's driving it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it's quite interesting, quite a few of the comments and the questions that we had from participants talked about young people becoming, you know, angry or argumentative after what perhaps is perceived as too much screen time. I mean, is there anything particularly about mood and different types of screen time?
So if we look at video games, for instance, we know that if you play kind of competitive and fast-paced games, then that can make you feel quite aroused at that particular time. And if that's the point that you then start having a conversation about stop doing this thing, then that's probably where these sorts of arguments in part lead from. I think this is why it's important to try and be curious about what it is that kids are doing and trying to get involved in it in some way, because that can help those conversations. So a good example that I saw on Twitter recently was around so video games. If you play something like Fortnite, for instance, if you say, okay, you've got 15 minutes left to play, a round of Fortnite might not finish specifically at 15 minutes. So if you then try and enforce that rule by saying, okay, your 15 minutes is up, stop the game, but it's in the middle of a round, then that's going to cause an argument, because there are all sorts of other issues around that in terms of, you know, if they're playing Fortnite because they're talking to their friends, then they're just going to drop out and leave their friends at a loss. People don't want to kind of hinder the team that they're on and things like that. So if you reframe it and say, okay, you can have 2 more rounds of Fortnite, then at least you know that there's a clearer stop that everybody can see that there is for that particular game. So it's about kind of getting that understanding of the games that they're playing or the social media that they're using and why they're using it and who they're talking to and why they're talking to those people, that can help maybe just head off some of those arguments before they start.
Brilliant, that's really helpful, Pete. And there was one other question that came up in the chat box here, which is, are there any studies of a clinical population? I guess people are thinking there about perhaps young people that are accessing mental health services or have a mental health problem.
I think there are some studies that, off the top of my head, honest answer, I don't know. I think there are some studies that include clinical populations as subsamples, but off the top of my head, I don't know what the findings are for those populations.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thanks, Pete. Okay, so I think we're going to leave it there for the moment, but there's going to be time to come back to Pete to pose any other questions. So please do keep those coming. But thank you very much, Pete. That's been really, really useful and helpful. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen now, because I just wanted to flag up some other upcoming events we've got just now. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. Oh, for some reason, it keeps flicking to the wrong thing. Apologies. So yeah, so just wanted to flag the Emerging Minds Network this is just the second in our series of webinars on topics regarding children and young people's mental health at this time during COVID-19. So we've got 2 more coming up next week around social isolation, but also looking at children and young people with autistic spectrum disorder. So please do take a look at our website if you're interested in that. I also wanted to draw your attention to our co-space study. So this is a study to try and learn how families are coping with the challenges of COVID-19. So we're particularly looking for parents and carers of children in school years, kind of right from foundation or reception up to year 11. So please do help us spread the word on that. As you can see on the slide here, we have got findings that are coming out in real time. So we're really committed to sharing the findings of these regarding, you know, how families are balancing work and the needs of their children, how much time, for example, people are spending on connecting with friends online. So we'll be sharing those on a regular basis. And I also wanted to share with you some of the resources we've got on the website. So for some reason I can't move my slides on, but essentially we've got some resources that hopefully are helpful to you, but we'll share all those when we send you all the materials after this. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now because we are going to be handing over to Amy. So I was actually going to say a little bit about Amy. I realised, sorry, Amy. So yeah, so we're delighted to have Dr. Amy Orben join us, who's a research fellow at the University of Cambridge, and whose work focuses on how digital technologies affect adolescent psychological wellbeing and mental health. So warm welcome to you, Amy.
Thanks, Emily. Great. Well, and hello to everyone. So I'll be following up Pete's great presentation and talking a bit more about what we know about screen time and social media use and how that relates to adolescent mental health. I've been researching kind of both screen time and social media use for 5 years now, and and have bounced between the two. So parts of this presentation will sometimes be about screen time in general and sometimes about social media use in particular. But a lot of the results are very similar. So I'll highlight if they're different, but if I do switch around, don't kind of get worried about that I'm losing track. So I need to, there. Great. So the kind of putting the last slide to the front, it's the key message is really that things are really complicated, and especially in a crisis like now, there's not really a lot of space to oversimplify things, because the complexity of this also means that we need to react to screen time differently. And this is important because there's been a huge amount of oversimplification over the last couple of years, something that really drove me to do research in this area as well. But you know, we've had Jeremy Hunt, when he was still Minister for Health, saying that social media poses as great a risk to children as obesity. We've had people liken smartphones to hard drugs like cocaine, all linking them to kind of the huge decreases in mental health we've been seeing, and that they've destroyed a generation, more or less. And so this is a really key question, what we actually know about screen time and social media use. And I'll be going kind of synthesizing the literature throughout this short presentation. So the first thing that we know about the link, so the correlation between screen time and adolescent well-being, is that it is negative. Like if I open up any data set, and you would normally find that those teenagers that are reporting more social media use or more screen time than others also on average report lower mental health and well-being measures. That doesn't tell us anything about the causality, something that Pete, you know, really skillfully covered. But that's what has driven a lot of this conversation, because of that oversimplification. And there's two reviews I put here, one from myself and another great one published in January by Candice Odgers and Mikey Jensen, that really go through this, that there is this negative correlation. Very understanding what is driving it. Is it an actual causal effect linking screen time to decrease in mental health? Is it driven by parenting? Is it driven by socioeconomic status? It's a really complex interaction. So that's kind of what we know there at the moment. Crucially, is that that correlation is really, really small. And we often don't really talk about the size of effects. We just want to know whether it's there or not. But it's actually really important to know what is the size of this that we're actually talking about. And that's actually quite difficult to communicate. So a really handy way to think about this is what I've done in a recent paper with Andrew Shabilsky, was to compare the correlation between screen time, so technology use and well-being, to the correlation of other things in a child's or a teenager's life with well-being. For example, how does being left or right-handed correlate with their well-being, or how does wearing glasses correlate with their well-being? So you see on the graph that the correlation between screen time and well-being is small and negative. So it's negative 0.04 in this graph of UK teenagers. And being left or right-handed doesn't really matter at all. It's near to zero. How tall you are and how much you use a bicycle correlates positively with well-being, but again, in a very small amount, but on the other direction. And wearing glasses correlates negatively with well-being, and even a bit more than technology use. But these are all tiny effects. And the hope is that this kind of metaphor, this framing, will make us kind of reconsider that the size is really important. We don't normally talk about banning glasses, and so this just shows that we need to have a more in-depth conversation about these things and how big the effects actually are. This is especially the case because we don't know the causality. We don't actually know what is driving this correlation in these data sets. And recent evidence really shows that it is really complicated, and the link between something like social media use and life satisfaction is clearly bidirectional. So in a study on, again, a UK sample of teenagers that were studied over 9 years, if a teenager increased their own social media use from their own average in 1 year, that predicted a small decrease in life satisfaction 1 year later. But also if their life satisfaction decreased from their own average in 1 year, that also predicted an increase in social media use. And so this shows us that the kind of effects we're looking at are probably extremely complicated, much more complicated than this kind of circular graph I'm showing on the screen. And that's lastly because, and this is the most important point, is that things are highly individual. And the way I try to explain this normally is through a metaphor of a chocolate bar. So many of us would agree that if you would ask a researcher to explain whether a certain child, your child, or somebody in your school, or somebody who you're treating, how they will react to eating a chocolate bar without any other information about them, that's really, really hard and almost impossible. The researcher would need to know, is that child a diabetic? Because if it is, then eating that chocolate bar could be really, really harmful, even leading on deadly. But if the child has just come off the football pitch or is an athlete, then that might replenish their energy level and be really helpful. And we need to know about the frequency. Are we talking about eating a chocolate bar every minute, or every 10 minutes, every hour, every day? And about the motivations. Does that child want to eat the chocolate bar because they're bored or lonely or sad, or because they're hungry, or because it's their birthday? And so this sort of nuance is really important for when we talk about things like social media use and screen time as well. And that sort of contextual information is just as important. We just don't talk about it yet as much because I think screen time is just newer than diet, for example. We need to think about the type of user, and kids and teenagers are very, very different, and they will be very differently affected by the same type of use. For example, just looking at happy couples on Instagram might have a very positive effect on a teenager that has just found itself in a positive, maybe a first positive romantic relationship, but could be really distressing for one of them that's just gone through a pretty harsh breakup. We cannot go into that detail at the moment, but what we can study is, for example, how different, if males or females react to social media. And this is, again, going back to my longitudinal study. This graph just shows how life satisfaction and different levels of different measures of life satisfaction affect social media use 1 year later. And this is just for teenage girls. You can see that a lot of them are in the negative spectrum, so to the left of the 0 y-axis. But now, so this is again girls, it's now going to transfer to teenage boys, and most of those are non-significant. The kind of confidence intervals overlap with the y-axis. And this shows a really profound gender difference for life satisfaction predicting social media use. And that's the same the other way around. Social media is predicting life satisfaction. This is teenage boys. Again, a lot smaller directional effects, and teenage girls are a lot larger. And actually, gender is only a really small amount. Like there might be other individual differences that are way more important, and we need to look at those in future. Lastly, I wanted to talk about the type of use is also really important to think about. As Pete mentioned, just saying social media use even, it's so diverse that you would really expect different types of use to make a big difference. For example, in the social media literature, there's an idea about active versus passive use. So active use of social media is like chatting to friends, posting on blogs, writing to each other. And that seems to be hypothesized to increase feelings of social connection, and that may be possibly boost well-being, compared to passive use of social media, which is just scrolling through content, not interacting with anyone, which could instead lead to social comparison, envy, anxiety, and therefore decrease in well-being. This has all not been really tested properly, especially in the current social isolation, but is interesting to keep in mind. So my last point is that there is a real lack of evidence. And this has been highlighted by the chief medical officer in their report last year, saying that we really cannot give guidelines yet about how much screen time people should have or how much they use social media, because there is not that evidence there yet, and because it's so highly individual. And they highlight, as Pete also has, the report from the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health, which really says that to understand how a single child or teenager is affected by screens or social media, you need a lot of contextual information. And the people who really have that contextual information are parents, caretakers, and those close to them. And so they should be empowered to make these decisions. While that's not an easy answer, that's probably the best answer that we have at the moment. Great, so it's complicated. And thank you for listening.
Brilliant, thank you. We'll give you a virtual round of applause there, Amy. Thank you for that. So now we were going to really open up to a bit of a broader discussion in some of the time we've got left with Amy and Pete. Now we've had quite a few questions. Oh yes, thank you. Someone doing some virtual clapping on the chat box. So we've had quite a few questions come in as people registered, but also some really great questions coming in on the question and answer box. So please do add any there if you have anything burning. So one thing I wanted to perhaps pose to you was this question, perhaps start with this question here. Someone's mentioned, should I be concerned that my son is spending every waking moment on his Mac? And then I think that links really well here to a question Lucinda's asked, which is, she says, kids' impulse control is really poor, mainly talking teenagers. Given a chance, they will waste hours on screen. And what are your thoughts about balancing parenting screen time, perhaps banning screens, and teenagers' impulse to spend hours on the screen? I don't know if you want to, I know you've said a little bit about this, Pete, haven't you, about kind of how parents can tackle this. Do you want to say a little bit more now? And then perhaps I'll ask Amy to chip in as well. Yeah,
so I think we have to be careful around the language that we use, for one. So I sort of saw this in one of the questions as well. I think you are right that, kids do struggle with impulse control, but time on screens is not necessarily wasted time. Again, it goes back to the idea of what is it that they're doing. Even if it's spending 2 or 3 hours playing a video game, that's not wasted time necessarily, because it plays really important, certainly during developmental periods of life. Understanding how we navigate around social rules and regulations and settings, all of which you can do in video games, is a really important skill to muster. If they're playing games with their friends and chatting to their friends, given that they can't see their friends at the minute, then that's really important too, because it gives them a chance to kind of maintain those friendships. So really it goes back to the idea of understanding what it is that they're doing on their screens and being involved in it. And that's not saying, being a helicopter parent and just hovering over their shoulder all the time, but understanding what it is they're doing and why they want to do it, taking part where it's appropriate or fun to do, and then maybe suggesting other things at times where you want to have separated or segregated family time. And that can be things like, I don't know, playing board games, not Monopoly because it's the worst game in the world, watching TV together, going out for a walk together, those sorts of things. Just trying to avoid the kind of hard stick approach of imposing rules and bans, which there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they don't work. To give one example, South Korea enacted a shutdown policy, I think in 2011, because they were concerned about the impact of online internet games, teenagers using those, and the impact on their sleep and in turn their academic achievement. So they imposed a curfew from midnight until 6. For teenagers on internet games, and it had the net effect of overall increasing the amount of time that they spent playing games, because they just shifted it to earlier in the day, and I think it increased their sleep on average by about 1 to 2 minutes. So it spectacularly failed, even though it seems on the surface of it, a sensible thing to do. So I think it's more about those kind of collaborative conversations and being curious about what they're doing rather than worrying too much about this being wasted time.
Brilliant. Did you want to add anything, Amy, to that?
Well, I think I was interested in the kind of how the question about spending so much time on the MacBook. And I think like I sometimes sit in a train carriage and also have this feeling being like, everybody's on their phone, you know, where is our society going? And then I try to imagine, you know, probably everybody's doing something different on their phone. Somebody's doing a Sudoku, the other person is talking to a friend, the other person is checking the news. And you know, 20 years ago, that would have all been different physical activities that have now all transferred to the same digital medium. And so I think that's the important thing, is to move away from seeing it as time on the MacBook and trying to, even though you're on the other side and you cannot see that diversity of use, to kind of try to disentangle that in conversation. And I think that's probably the thing which will probably progress as well quite quickly as a society now, to think about this diversity, because screens aren't a medical molecule that we ingest and that changes our blood and brain and kind of changes our body. It's something very different. It's the activities that we do on it. So, and that's why it's also hard to give kind of judgments on specific children, because we're not in that room with them. And we know, you know, that small proportions of the population might have a problem with screens, just like a small proportion of population have a problem with regulating other things in their lives, like diet. But yeah, I think on the whole, it's all about the diversity, and trying to figure that out with the teenager themselves.
Brilliant, thank you. So let's try and tackle a few other questions. We've got some really great ones here. So this is perhaps a bit of a broader question. So I think you mentioned, Pete, about the research that's been done around looking at social skills and kind of screen time. So a couple of people have built on that, really. So I think Louise was asking about kind of activities that screen time might be displacing, so perhaps the effect on other skills development. And I think Catherine was asking about, is there any evidence about any more recent research around the impact of kind of time on the screens affecting cognitive skills, attention? Quite a broad one.
They're really good questions. I think, so I tend to be as not dubious, but as critical of research purporting things like positive effects of playing video games as I do the ones that suggest negative effects, again, because it's really hard to do research in this area. There's some early research that suggests that people who are action video game players tend to have faster reaction times or better kind of motor skills and things like that. I'm not massively convinced that that's properly borne out in the rest of the data that we've seen more recently. An obvious kind of route here is with things like brain training games and brain training apps, which you see quite a lot of on the mobile app stores. There's basically no convincing evidence to suggest that you see any transfer effects for those sorts of games. So if you play a memory game over and over again, a few times a day, every day for say 6 weeks, you will get better at that game. But that doesn't necessarily mean that your memory generally improves. There are some very small studies that need to be improved on, which suggest that if you create very specific games that are targeted at certain populations, so for example, older populations who are starting to go through cognitive decline, that you can improve things like memory and attention, and that does transfer out of the game. But like I say, these are studies of say 10 to 12 people. They're very small kind of pilot studies at the minute. What was the other part of the question? Sorry, I sort of rattled on a little bit there. And,
I can jump in about the displacement hypothesis.
Displacement, that was the other one.
Yeah, because I think that's really interesting. And that's kind of our folk theory, you know, that's the way we think about screens normally as policymakers, as parents, as researchers. That's kind of the default, to think that a minute on screen is a minute not doing something else. The first thing is that we need to kind of challenge that thinking, because it's going to be very different for different teenagers. You know, if you're a teenager growing up in inner city Chicago, which has high crime rate, a minute or 10 minutes spent on video games might be 10 minutes not spent outside in a high crime area, while for an upper middle class child in the UK, that might be 10 minutes not spent in an after school club. And so the displacement hypothesis is really difficult to work with because, again, it goes back to that highly individualized situation the child is in. And that we as researchers, because we often come from more privileged echelons of society, just like policymakers do, we often kind of think straight away that 10 minutes on FIFA is not 10 minutes playing piano or 10 minutes helping your mom cook. And I think it's really changing now with the crisis as well. You know, what is it displacing anymore? And I think that's why our thinking is being challenged, because, yeah, what does 10 minutes on a social video game with their friends displace? It's 10 minutes not being with their friends, maybe. And so this is something we've really need to come to grips with. And it's really interesting as a researcher at the moment. But I don't think there's a lot of research there yet. But I think challenging that thinking about displacement is something, a very interesting mental arithmetic to do.
Thank you both. So there's a couple of things I wanted to cover then. One, a couple of people have asked about sleep. So can you tell us about any research around the effects of kind of interacting on a screen and sleep? Is there much research about that? Do you want to talk about Amy? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, the results are very mixed. So there's really great work coming out of Glasgow, Dr. Holly Scott and Heather Woods, who've done a lot of work on sleep and screen time. Mainly what they've, an interesting takeaway from that is that that screen time does seem to kind of cause bedtime to move a bit back, but a lot of times, especially on weekends, teenagers just wake up a bit later. And so it's mainly during the school days where that's problematic because they have a key wake up time. I've done some work which has shown very mixed effects. In some data sets, we found a negative relationship between screen time and when they went to sleep. In others, we didn't. So again, things are still really unclear. That's probably also because we're really bad at measuring screens time. You know, we don't know what that is. And it's really hard to measure exactly how much they had at what point during the day. So I think the Royal Society for Public Health and the Chief Medical Officer have said to kind of look specifically at time before bed. It's not hugely based on evidence, but it is a time that people have agreed we should be a bit more watchful of. But yeah, there's not a lot of research to kind of go into any more detail.
Brilliant, thank you, Amy. So I wanted also, so a couple of people have mentioned about the kind of content. So this might be a bit broad, but if someone's asked a question about, is there any research around the impact of, perhaps particularly, for example, at the moment where people are consuming media, quite distressing media content at a high level, any evidence about the impact of that, but also around sexual content and violent content. I mean, I know you touched on that, Pete, didn't you, about the kind of, perhaps when we see violence in video games and that doesn't necessarily translate. But what people have raised concerns about, yeah, sexual content, but also distressing content in the media. I don't know if you can shed any light on that for us. Pete, do you want to?
I don't know too much about general things like misinformation and content in the media in that sense. What I would kind of urge as a note of caution is that I think there are going to be lots of studies that come out in the next few weeks and months that claim to show effects in this area in terms of what the impact of reading too much about coronavirus as an example is on mental health. And I would urge people to take those studies with a pinch of salt, because they will be very rapid, and actually the effects that I think really we're more worried about are those long-term effects on people's mental health and well-being, and we won't see the effects of those for a long time. I think the question around things like sexual content in games, I think Alex asked it, and it was specifically around games like Grand Theft Auto, which we're finding a lot of young kids playing. I think the key there is that young kids shouldn't be playing those games. So this is why it's really important to be curious about the types of games that kids are playing, because games have rating systems. They have pan-European gaming industry rating systems that suggest that there are certain types of games that are appropriate or not appropriate for certain age groups. Just in the same way that we wouldn't allow an 8-year-old to watch an 18-rated movie, we shouldn't be allowing an 8-year-old to play an 18-rated game for these sorts of reasons, because there is adult-themed content in video games that we wouldn't necessarily want to expose, not necessarily, we wouldn't want to expose younger children to. And you're only going to know about that if you're actually engaging with what it is that they're playing and what it is that they want to play. One of the links that I put on my presentation was to a website called Ask About Games. And I think that's a really useful resource because it lists a lot of popular games that are out at the minute and talks about the age ratings and the sort of content in them. And I think that's a useful thing to look at, because if you've got a kid who's saying, I really want to play this game, I really want to play this game, can you buy it for me? And you know that it's not appropriate for them. Websites like that and that sort of understanding and knowledge will allow you to not just say, no, end of story, but say, no, this isn't an appropriate game for these reasons. How about this game instead? This is a good game. Because GTA is not the only game out there. It's not even the best game out there. There are lots of good games out there that fulfill a lot of kind of this action, fast-paced content without the need for these more adult themes in them.
Thank you. Thanks, Pete. Okay, so I think we're coming to the end of the webinar. So thank you for everyone for sticking with us. It's been really, really helpful. So I just wanted to invite Amy and Pete to just give any final kind of concluding remarks, really. Anything you'd like us to take away with this, any practical implications of what we know so far from the research. And if you are listening on the live stream or you're in the webinar, also do share with us your takeaway thoughts or any outstanding questions that you have. That'd be really great to hear. But perhaps go to you, Amy, for any kind of concluding takeaways.
Yeah, I think we're still at the very beginning of understanding screens and technology. And I think it's almost difficult always to be a researcher in this field because we cannot give the advice that people are asking for. And I guess the hope is by being very clear where there's no evidence, that people will start having a bit more confidence to challenge some of the unbased claims that we often hear in the media, for example. I think the crucial thing for us to do as society, just as us as researchers have to do increasingly, is to move beyond screen time. You know, even if we're sitting behind and we're only seeing the back of the laptop or the back of the smartphone, there are really diverse uses going on there. And those uses will be determinant of the outcomes that it's having on the user. And so any advice that is given on the basis of just time spent on a certain type of screen will not be beneficial for on an individual level. And research is always aggregating over a huge amount of people. And so giving individual advice is really hard. But I think there it is all about empowerment, and that, you know, we have seen that things aren't extremely harmful. They're really dependent on the person and the use. And so, especially at this time, they really do allow for social connection to happen. That is very clear. Social connection is crucial for teenagers. And so we should encourage that, but also make sure that we look at what other things are being done and to have that reflection about why they're being done. And that, while that is not the easy answer, I wish I could give a better answer. I hope that also gives some solace.
Thanks so much, Amy. That's really helpful. And Pete, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of echo Amy's comments there, in that it might seem like well, we don't know what's going on sort of conversation that we've been having, but I think that's crucially important at this point in time, because I think so many parents are beating themselves up about the fact that they don't know what to do with their kids, and screen time's going through the roof and it's melting their brains and it's all going to be horrible. And I think one of the take homes to say today is that, you know, it's okay, you know, don't be too hard on yourself in this sort of scenario. Things are going to change. We can't be as productive as we used to be. It's a lot of it is just about getting through the day, right? And if your kids want to play video games, then actually that's fine. They're not going to turn into mindless murderers or anything like that. Certainly not from what we know about the research. So just kind of give yourself a bit of slack in that sense, and just try and engage, basically. Become curious about these sorts of things. You know, I love video games. Video games are great. I wrote a book about them last year. And I think one of the important things about video games is that they allow us to explore what it means to be human, and allow us to explore human emotions and human interactions and our own moral compass, actually within a relatively safe environment. And I think that's quite important at this point in time, when we actually can't go outside and have those face-to-face interactions. So, you know, have a look around some of those resources and see what sorts of games out there that might take your fancy, that you might be interested in. And there are lots that you can share with your kids out there.
Brilliant, thank you, Pete. And I think some of those reflections also kind of reflected in the chat box there. So if you haven't looked at that, it's quite interesting to see what our participants are saying on our webinar here. And I'm sure there's a similar conversation going on the YouTube live stream, but people, yeah, seem to really be taking away Amy's point that it's complicated, but and Pete's point, we should all give ourselves a bit of a break at this time. Brilliant. So I wanted to wrap up now. Please do keep telling us what you're taking away from today, and perhaps if there's any questions that you're left with, that's also really helpful for us to know. But yes, I wanted to say a massive thank you to Amy and Pete for being here and giving us their time and sharing their expertise today, and also to Andre, who's been beavering away behind the scenes to make sure we can share this session as widely as possible from the mental health. And yeah, don't forget, we've got 2 more webinars coming up next week, which I mentioned, around social isolation, but also children and young people with autistic spectrum disorder. You can sign up for those again for free. And we are going to be organising similar events like this, so please do let us know what other topics are on your mind at the moment that you'd like to hear from researchers such as Amy and Pete about. So yeah, please do keep tweeting and letting us know what you think. But yes, I'll wrap up there. Lovely to engage with you all today. Thank you for joining us very much. Bye now.